Panorama TV presents Digital Photography One-on-One, where we answer your questions. Here's your host, Mark Wallace.
Hey everybody, welcome to this week's episode of Digital Photography One-on-One. I'm Mark Wallace. Well, we're continuing our series where we're talking about metering. Specifically this week, we're going to be talking about the basics of metering with a light meter like this one. So let's start by looking at our question. This week we get a question from our overseas friends. This one's from Christopher in Poland, and Christopher asks, how do you use a light meter to measure continuous light and strobes? Well, Christopher, with a light meter like this one, metering is very simple. Just think of the exposure triangle. In the exposure triangle, you have aperture, shutter, and ISO. And those three things work together to give you the correct exposure. With a light meter, you enter the ISO and one other part of the exposure triangle, and the meter gives you the third part. For example, you can enter the ISO and the shutter speed, and when you take a reading, the meter will give you the correct aperture value. Or you can enter the ISO and the aperture value, and the meter will give you the correct shutter speed. Now remember, if you're metering studio strobes, you'll always enter the ISO and the shutter speed, and the meter will give you the correct aperture value. Well, today I'm using the Sekonic L358 to show you some of the modes that we have, and I highly recommend using Sekonic light meters because they're, I think, the best meters on the market. You can't find one that's better. So we're going to take a look at these modes here. Now we have several modes, and these are what you'll see at the top of your light meter, and we're going to go through these one by one. The very first one here looks like a sunshine. That is called daylight or ambient mode. And that's the mode that you would use if you're metering anything that has continuous light, like the sun, or if you have tungsten lights, or if you have continuous lights in the studio that are always on. This is the mode that you'll use. It's very common on all light meters. In fact, all light meters have this, and that's the one you'll use for constant light. Now the next one is called, it's got a little flash here on our Sekonic meters. It's called Auto Reset Cordless Flash Metering, or Cordless Flash Mode. It's a mouthful, but really what this does, it allows your meter to, you push a button and it waits. And it'll wait up to about 90 seconds, and it's waiting for a flash to fire. So that's really nice if you don't have a sync cable or a radio trigger to use. We're going to actually go over this in one of our upcoming episodes on advanced metering using a Sekonic light meter. Now there's another one here, it's got a little C, and that's for corded flash. And this has been around for years and years and years. And what that allows you to do is take your light meter and plug in a cable, it's called a sync cable, and that goes to your flash. And so when you push the meter reading button on the side of your meter, your flash will fire. So this is on, again, all light meters. It's been around for years and years and years. Now recently, companies have come out, most notably Pocket Wizard, that allow you to replace that cable with a radio trigger. And so this is the mode that we have here. It's called Wireless Flash Radio Triggering Mode. And that little radio antenna there, sometimes it looks like a T because it's not as big as our big screen here, but it's actually an antenna. And what that allows you to do is when you take a meter reading, it triggers your flashes wirelessly. Okay, now that you know about the modes, we're going to show you two of these modes, basic ambient metering and wireless radio triggering. We're going to show you the basics of both of those modes. So we're going to start with ambient reading. So let's get going. All right, so let's first talk about how to meter ambient light. Erica here is our model, and what we're doing is I've set my Sekonic meter here to ambient mode, which is the first little mode right here on the dial. And what we can do here is in ambient mode, we can choose to either shoot in aperture priority or shutter priority, meaning that I'll tell the meter, I know what aperture I want to shoot at, you tell me what shutter speed to put my camera on, or I can say I know what shutter speed to shoot at, you tell me what aperture value to set my camera to. So we're going to start out with our meter set to aperture priority mode. And so what I've done is I've set two variables. I've set my ISO value at 100, which is what my camera is set to, and I've set my aperture value to 2.8. That's the aperture I want to shoot at. What I don't know is what shutter speed to use. So it's very simple. Once I have those two things set, on the side of the meter here, there is a meter button, and I can push that. So I'm going to just put this right under Erica's chin. I'm going to point this right at my camera, and then when I push this, it tells me my shutter speed. So my shutter speed is 400. So now I can just walk back to my camera, set my aperture to 2.8, my shutter to 400, and I could shoot that and it would be a perfect exposure. Now let's pretend like I had a certain shutter speed I want to use. So I'm going to pull a number out of the air. I'm going to say I want to shoot at 125th of a second. Well, I'm going to put this in a different mode. I'm going to push my mode button. I'm going to roll to the left, and now I've got a little square around the T, which is the time value. So I'm going to tell it I want to set my shutter speed to 125. I'm doing that by just rolling this, and as I roll that, it changes the shutter speed. So 125, and I need to know what aperture value to use. Well, I don't actually have to re-meter it. It will just tell me. It knows what my last meter reading is, but we'll verify it. So I'll do this, and I'll click. And again, yeah, it just says 5. And so now I know that if I put my camera on 125, I need to set my aperture value to 5, and then I'll get a perfect exposure. Now, what if I wanted to know what would happen, let's say, if I needed to shoot at ISO 200 or 400? Well, I don't even have to re-meter. I can just push this ISO button, and then I can roll my dial, and let's say I'm going up to ISO 400. It says I need to go to F10. If I go down to 200, it'll tell me, oh, I need to shoot at 7.1. So the nice thing about a meter is that you can just meter once and then change all the different parameters to see, what different exposures are going to do. So you can make the creatively correct decision. So I'm going to put my ISO back down to 100, and I'm going to set my camera to 125 and an aperture value of 5. So let me go over and do this. Now I have my camera set to manual mode, and that's what you want to do when you're using a light meter like this, because you're not using the built-in meter anymore. So I've set my camera to manual mode, so I'm going to set my shutter speed to 125 and my aperture value to 5, and I have my ISO at 100, so everything matches what my meter was. So Erica will look right at me, perfect, and I can look on the back here. It's a perfect exposure. And that's how simple it is to use a light meter on location when you're metering ambient light. Now we're going to go into the studio and look at how to meter light in a studio lighting situation. All right, now that we're in the studio, let's talk about a couple of different modes that our meter can do. Again, here we're with Erica. And what we're going to show you first is there's a mode that allows you to hook up a sync cable to your meter. And that is almost every single light meter has that. But we're going to use a pocket wizard that's built into this, so we don't really need this here. So I'm going to throw that away. So I'm going to change my mode, and I've got a mode here that has a little antenna on that. And what that means is I'm going to trigger my flash wirelessly. So when I push my metering mode, my flash fires. And so that's the way I recommend you set up your meter, is use a Seiconic with a built-in pocket wizard. That way you don't have to have that nasty sync cable built in. Okay, so what we do here is, again, we're going to set 2 parameters and let the meter solve for the third. But when you're shooting in a studio, really you have to set 2 specific parameters. That is the ISO setting and the shutter speed. And your shutter speed should be set to your camera's sync speed. Now I've done 3 or 4 videos in the past on sync speed, so we're not going to cover that here, but you can go back into our digital photography one-on-one videos and see a bunch of videos on sync speed, so take a look at those. But on the camera that I'm shooting with, the sync speed is 200th of a second, so I've set my meter to 200th of a second, and I've set my ISO to 100, and so again my ISO is set to 100, some kind of cameras like some of the Nikons can only go to ISO 200 as their lowest ISO setting. So if I was shooting with a Nikon like a D90 or something, I'd set this to ISO 200. But the point is you want to keep your ISO as low as possible in the studio so you don't have a lot of noise. So I'm setting mine to ISO 100. My camera's sync speed is 200, and then the other thing that I'm going to get is the aperture value. And really when you're in a studio, that's really all you're looking for is the aperture value. So a lot of times when you have an assistant or somebody metering, they're just calling out a number like 7 or 6.5 or 5.4 or 4.5, something like that. And they're not saying anything else, just like, oh, it's metering at 4.5. Because all you really care about is the aperture value. So what I'm going to do here is this little lumisphere thing, make sure that it's up when you are metering in the studio, getting general lighting. Now there are some reasons why you would have to have this down, and so in a few weeks we're going to have some advanced metering techniques, and so we'll talk about when you need to have this down. For basics though, you want to have this up, and you want to put this as close as possible to your subject. Now ideally you want to have your lumisphere as close to the eyes of a model as possible if you're shooting portraits. Now I don't do that because I don't want to jab somebody in the eye, and so it's really uncomfortable sticking this in front of somebody's face. So what I do instead is I'll put it right underneath a person's chin, and that makes sure that this is in line with their eyes, so I'm getting about the exact same distance from the light by putting it under their chin, and it's a little less intimidating than, oh, I'm going to stick you in the eye. Okay, so that's why I stick it there. And then the lumisphere needs to point right down the lens of the camera's lens. So right down the barrel of the lens, I guess. So point this right at your camera, push the meter button, the flash fires, and then I'm looking here, this says f11. That's my aperture value, and I would set my camera to this value, f11, take a shot, and I'll have a perfect exposure. So it's very, very simple. Let me go over it one more time. Set your ISO and your shutter speed exactly the same as your camera, then meter under the chin, right at the camera. And once you do that, it's going to tell you what the aperture value is. Set your camera to the aperture value, and you'll have a perfect exposure. Now there's one other thing I need to cover really, really quickly to make sure that your meter and your camera are set correctly. And that is, out of the box, a lot of meters move in half-stop increments, and most cameras move in third-stop increments. So on a Seikonic meter, you can adjust your meter to either move in half, full, or third-stop increments. So I suggest you make sure your meter is set to third-stop increments, and there are different ways to do that. So make sure you check your user manual, because on different meters, there are different ways to do that. On this one, there's some switches on the back. And if you have this meter, the best way to do it is the first 2 switches down and then the last 2 switches up, and that'll get you in the right settings. For other meters, make sure you check your user manual. Okay, now what we're going to do is I'm going to take a couple of pictures and just show you what this looks like here at 200, f11, ISO 100. So Erica, are you ready? Awesome. Okay, we're going to take a couple of pictures and show you how that looks. Awesome, well those pictures look really good, and those are the basics of metering. So please stay tuned for part 4 of our series, where we talk about some advanced light metering tricks with this, the Seikonic L758DR. We're going to be talking about how to get light ratios to look right and dynamic range and all kinds of stuff like that. So please stay tuned, and to make sure you don't miss a single second of our videos, please subscribe. And as usual, if you have questions about photography or photography-related gear, you can send those to me at askmark@adorama.com. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next week.
This episode is brought to you by Adorama TV. Visit the Adorama Learning Center, where you'll find photography tips and techniques, links to the gear used in this episode, and related videos. For all the latest photography, video, and computer gear, visit adorama.com. And the next time you're in New York City, visit our store located on 18th Street between 5th and 6th Avenue.